And hey, Debbie. And for those of you that are on right now, I'm going to give it a couple minutes for folks to join. And definitely not planning on just talking at y'all the whole time. I would like to do a bit of an overview and share with folks kind of my ethos around creative writing and also sort of the ways in which my background as a lawyer really informs that ethos. But then I'd love for it to be a discussion. So I really encourage folks to write in on the chat. Um, I think the organizers have mentioned that they're not going to have us be using the Q&A. So any questions or thoughts that you want to share, please go ahead and just put it in the chat. I'll do my best to keep an eye on it while we're chatting. And if I don't get to it in the moment, I'll definitely um, pause here and there to kind of check back in on the chat. Um, so let's maybe just give it like another 30 seconds or so. I just want to give people a little bit of grace since I know the sessions are back to back. But thank you to everyone who is here. Okay, I think I'll go ahead and get started. And as other folks join, that's great. So I'm Lindsay Bennett. Thank you so much for joining me today. And the title of my presentation is What Telling My Clients' Stories Has Taught Me About Telling My Own, and for that matter, other people's stories. Um, and sort of some reflections and thoughts that I hope are useful to you all out there. Um, I kind of doubt there are other death penalty lawyers here in the session, but if you are, chime in. Um, so a little bit of background and context, kind of about my path to both becoming a lawyer and kind of finding my way back to a different kind of writing. Um, so I've been practicing law for about 20 years. The primary area of my practice has been in death penalty defense, so representing folks that are on death row in different parts of the country. I've worked in several states. Um, and a lot of that work has been what's called post conviction work. And for you non lawyers out there, God bless you, first of all. And what that really means is I'm looking at cases where somebody is not facing trial, but they're already on death row. So I'm examining their cases and kind of going back to square one. Um, and so that's been kind of the last 20 years or so of my life. Around the time of COVID, I decided to take a step back. Actually, about 2 weeks before COVID, I had decided to take some time off work. So, um, some very convenient timing in a way. And like many of you, I found myself with more time on my hands and being at home on lockdown and quarantine and all that. And I decided to take a couple classes here and there. And I started taking a couple of graduate classes in creative writing, specifically in creative nonfiction, and just kind of fell back in love with writing. I had been writing for 20 years as a lawyer. The kind of lawyering I have been doing is largely writing. It's not in court. Um, but I had sort of a lot of the love I had once had for writing was really kind of close to extinguished by then. And that was for a couple of reasons. One is I think the rules and procedures of legal writing kind of kill the creativity in us. But the other reason is because the field that I have been working in primarily is a pretty tough field, and there's a lot of loss and a lot of pressure, and the stakes are very high, the highest. And having my writing tied to that was pretty unhealthy in a lot of ways, I think, as a writer. And so doing more creative writing these last few years has been really fun, but also almost kind of like healing to just enjoy writing again and not have it be life or death stakes. Um, so, with that being said, sort of why I think this will loop back to our larger topic. Some of you might be wondering, sort of like, why death penalty work? So a little bit of background on that piece. I was really drawn to it for a few reasons. One of which was I'm sort of a constitutional law geek, and there's a lot of constitutional law in death penalty work. So that was a big draw. Um, and I am definitely somebody who sort of roots for the underdog and sort of in David and Goliath kind of narrative framing. Being able to serve in a role that felt like I was a guardian against government overreach felt really important to me and still does. Um, and so those are kind of two more lawyer answers to that. I think the more human answer is I was really drawn to people's stories. And it's a kind of legal work that actually involves a lot of really deep, interesting, complicated stories. And I really wanted to kind of sink my teeth into that as a lawyer. And so, in terms of storytelling and what it's like to be a death penalty lawyer trying to tell stories, there's two sides, as everyone knows, right? Any of you out there who watch Law and Order, the prosecution, the defense. And so, skilled prosecutors, one of their jobs is really um, to sort of distill the story, to kind of uh, think of a story as sort of reductive, in the sense that prosecutors are really asking folks to focus on a singular act or maybe a series of acts, sort of a snapshot, if you will. Um, and that that snapshot is going to pave the way for getting a death verdict, which is their goal. On the defense side, our focus is, I think, more nuanced in many ways. Um, due respect to prosecutors out there. Um, Defense counsel are really the folks who are more interested in the deep story, right? And anyone who's interested in personal essay or memoir, that might resonate with you. So, defense counsel, we're looking at, what is sort of the story under the story. And we're not just interested in what happened, we're interested in why it happened. And so those two stories kind of come together and converge, right? And in the context of a trial, like any kind of trial, a decision maker, whether it's a judge or a jury, is presented with these two different versions, these sort of dueling narratives, if you will. And they have to choose which narrative strikes them as truer. And that choice is the outcome of the case. And in the case of death penalty cases, that means somebody's going to live or die based on that choice, right? And so, when I'm thinking about storytelling from a non legal standpoint, I'm thinking about a lot of the same things that I thought about as a legal writer. Um, and I'm hoping, some of this resonates for you all in your writing lives. So, when I'm thinking about, for example, character in a piece, whether it's nonfiction or fiction, I think this applies. You know, when I'm building the story and I'm building characters, or I'm interviewing people for a nonfiction piece, I want not just the snapshot, right? I want the whole photo album. I want to know who everybody is. I want to know why they're there, where they've been. I want to know what the relationships are between them and how that shapes their lives, the outcomes, etc. Um, and so, when I started turning my attention to more creative writing the past few years, um, I really found myself sort of harkening back to a lot of the same principles that I used in my legal writing, even though the stakes are obviously radically different and this is way more fun. um, and so, what are some of the things that I'm thinking about? I'll say at the outset, I'm definitely more of a nonfiction gal. So, for you fiction writers out there, hats off to you. Fiction is not my comfort zone. Hopefully, some of this is useful. I think there's so much power in telling true stories that I find myself drawn to that over and over again, both as a reader and a writer, honestly. Um, so here's some things I think about that might be useful. One is when I'm thinking about stories as a reader or a writer, I try to bear in mind that the story is about as much about the storyteller as it is about the story, right? So I kind of want to peel back the curtain. I want to understand the storyteller and the motivation and sort of what the perspective says about the story. And I'm trying to think about that when I'm writing as well, and sort of always interrogating my own motivation about what's driving me to write a piece. Um, the other thing I'll say is that I think story is as much about what's excluded as what's included. So, by analogy, one of the things I've been thinking about lately, I'm curious if any of you have had this experience, is when we go to museums, right? Um, Museums are telling us stories, right? And that story is curated and shaped by the staff of the museum. So we might be walking up and down the halls of a museum and, we're sort of taking in what they're giving us, right? And there's a lot to take in. It also raises all kinds of interesting questions for me about what's not on the walls or how this thing got on the wall. And I think for anyone who's been interested in some of the really important discussions that I think are being had around um, interrogating museum collections and the role of things like colonialism in museum collections, you know, there's a lot of layers, right, underneath the thing on the wall is sort of like how it ended up getting there. And, you know, sort of what the level of integrity is about an exhibit that we're taking in, which is also another kind of story. So I'm just throwing that out there as an example that, when we're doing our own writing, when we're doing reading, which I think is as important for writers, like I read as much as I can. I think it helps me become a better writer. I'm thinking a lot about the voice of the writer and how that shapes what I'm taking in. And I'm thinking a lot about what is being left out and why. Um, I think there are all kinds of reasons why we leave stuff out of our pieces. Many of them very, very legitimate and personal choices. I think there are also some uh, tougher self examinations that many of us could undertake, myself included, about the choices that we're making in what we include in our narratives. Um, in terms of owning the narrative, some of the things that I'm thinking about are things like voice and agency and representation, right? So if you're a writer who writes in your own voice, telling your own story, that's fairly straightforward, right? If you're a writer who's writing other people's stories, that gets a little trickier. Um, and it can be a wonderful product and writing exercise. It does require, I think, a little bit more introspection about, um, again, like sort of the voice that we use in our writing. And, if we are writing someone else's story, are we honoring them? Are we doing our best practices to um, give agency to their story um, and as authentically as we can, right? Um, and in terms of representation, again, I think these are really important things to just be thinking about for me personally, and for all of us as writers, that when we are writing outside our own experience, it behooves us um, to really think and be thoughtful about how we're framing other people's stories, um, so as to really provide the most respect and the most honest experience we can. Um, in terms of kind of the ways in which I focus my non-legal writing. One of the things that I often did as in my legal writing that I rely on here as well is if I start to feel unmoored in what I'm working on, if I've been working on a piece and I'm slogging through and kind of forget where the hooks are, I sort of go back to what the purpose of the piece is for me and really use that as an anchor. And it kind of brings me back and tethers me in a way that hopefully gets me back on track with what I'm writing. Um, but honestly, the other thing I try really hard to do is just remind myself to have fun with this. I've loved connecting with other writers and editors and readers on Medium, and I love all the different voices that I'm exposed to through the platform. It's a great way to connect with other creatives, and it helps me kind of keep my type A lawyer stuff in check a little bit, that I don't have to take everything so seriously, and that it ultimately is an exercise in connecting as people and as sort of using our creative energy to give voice to something that matters to us and that hopefully matters to others as well. Um, so I think, those are sort of like the broad strokes that I wanted to share. I see in the chat from um, one of you asking, how do I renew myself after dealing with tough cases, meaning death penalty cases, I assume. That's a great question, a difficult question. I mean, I think having other outlets in my life has been pretty imperative. Um, and, creative outlets are great for that. Physical outlets are great for that. Um, when I was younger and before I had kids, running was a big outlet for me to kind of decompress and kind of let go of some of the secondary trauma that I was carrying in my lawyer work. Um, and the creative writing for me these last few years has been great. It's kind of a nice marriage for me personally around, I still tend to write on issues that are important to me, sort of social justice issues, issues around race, around uh, marginalization, that sort of thing. So if any of you have read any of the pieces I've got up on Medium, I have a couple pieces that I've written about, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, which is an issue I care deeply about as a lawyer and as a human, as an American. Um, and, I'm definitely drawing from my personal perspective when I write those things, right? I'm writing as me, but also I am trying to draw on my perspective as someone who's been working in the legal field for a long time, and someone who's worked on women's issues for a long time, um, and who has an understanding of the legal landscape, and have tried to sort of pull all that together in a way that delivers something that resonates for readers. Um, And then, I've also focused a little bit more on some reporting pieces that are a little bit lighter, kind of combining my interests. I'm always very interested in issues around race in this country. I think it's an issue that permeates everything about the United States. Um, and I also am a lover of travel. That's a huge outlet for me and a release. And so one of the more recent pieces I wrote was about sort of travel experience for Black and Brown folks and the use of technology like TikTok and Instagram to connect um, in connection with travel experiences. Um, and that piece is maybe a good example of one of the things I'd mentioned about, sort of voice and agency. So, I'm a white woman, and I can certainly speak to some of the issues that come up in the context of traveling as a woman alone, which I've done quite a bit of in my life. Um, but I walk around the world with white privilege and with American privilege. And no matter where I travel, that tends to be something that benefits me, frankly. Um, but many of the people in my life who are near and dear to me do not carry that privilege. And so um, I had been really thinking about, through the lens of other travelers, non-white, non-American travelers in some instances, and wanting to have a better understanding of how they approach travel. And so I could have just written a piece about my opinion and my research on it, but that didn't feel authentic to me in terms of voice and representation. And I interviewed, I think, 5 people for that piece, all people of color who are travelers, who are in the industry, who are very knowledgeable and have incredible perspective to share. And then I, put the piece together using their perspectives and quotes and the offerings. So I really am loving having the freelance work kind of serve as a platform to connect with other people who can teach me and who I can learn from and who I can connect with. I imagine many of you as writers have found that as a great tool as well. Let's see. I see another question in the chat. What advice would I have in anyone considering to get into my career field? I'm not sure if you mean the legal field, the writing field, death penalty work. If you want to maybe clarify that, I don't want to answer the wrong legal field. Oh, Robert, don't do it. Just kidding. I mean, I think the legal field, has a lot of avenues, a lot of things to offer. I think it's good to sort of meditate on what your motivation is, because there's a huge amount of burnout in the legal field, in all areas, corporate, public interest, you name it. It's just a high burnout field. So think about really what motivates you and drives you, because some things will sustain you more than others. For me, 20 years of doing capital work has been a lot, maybe enough. Um, it's a pretty high burnout part of the field. But part of what has sustained me is having outlets outside the legal realm and having a lot of friends that aren't lawyers. And spending time outside and having creative endeavors to kind of balance out the right brain left brain stuff. I think that's pretty important, to just do that, really, whatever your field. So it's only something you can really answer for yourself, but I would, interrogate your motives a little bit and see if it really feels like the right fit for you, and whether you think what motivates you will sustain you in the long term. Because it's a lot of work and a lot of time, and it's a difficult field to find balance in if you're not very deliberate about it. I hope that helped. Um, what were the biggest similarities I noticed between people on death row and those who have never been incarcerated? Oh, tons of similarities, tons and tons. Folks on death row are in many ways just like everyone else. The only difference is that they're in prison for murder and ended up on death row. But I have always found personally in working in that field that we have a lot more in common than we do that separates us. Um, and I think the biggest differences that I've seen in working with folks who are in prison, whether it be on death row or otherwise, because I've been visiting prisons all over the country for 2 decades, um, is just resources. I mean, that's what a lot of it boils down to is folks that get funneled into the criminal justice system, without getting on that soapbox too much, tend to be folks that have fewer resources in every regard in our society, fewer support systems. Um, and that is definitely a big factor in sort of um, the sort of prison pipeline that exists in this country, the prison industrial complex that still operates very robustly. Um, but other than the sort of obvious difference with, most of you probably haven't killed anyone. Um, but they're people just like you and me. They have things they love, they have things they're scared of, they have interests, they have dreams, they, want to not be thought of solely as the worst thing they ever did. And, something to think about since the question was asked is like, do any of us want to be thought about exclusively for the worst act we ever committed, the worst thing we ever did, our worst day? And I would think that's a pretty universal no. None of us want to be thought of solely for that, right? We're much more complicated than that. We've all had bad days and not been our best selves. Some people's bad days are worse than others, right? Um, but I think that actually circles back to the sort of deeper narrative point that I made at the beginning, which is, we can think of stories and people as a snapshot, or we can think of, you know, hold space for something deeper, something bigger than that. Um, and, you know, the sort of layers of our lives and our stories, like many of us probably feel like we've all lived several lives already, if we're lucky. Um, and there are some things that probably really lifted us and propelled us in our lives, and there are things that held us back or set us back in meaningful ways. That's the human condition, I think. It's why storytelling is so important because I think we are here to learn from each other. I think we all have something to teach and all have a lot to learn. Um, I hope that when I write, that ultimately it's a connection and that people who read my work feel like they got something out of it. Maybe it shifted their perspective even a smidge. I did persuasive legal writing for 20 years, and my job was to convince people that weren't on my side. So I probably tend to lean on that pretty hard in my other writing. But I think it's really what we're all doing as humans all the time, right? We want to be seen, we want to be understood. Um, so there are different ways to do that. Nonfiction writing is one of them, but it's far from the only one. So I know we have just a couple minutes left. If there are any other questions, let's see. Catherine. With my profession in writing other people's stories, do I feel like it helps my creative writing as I write story arcs in creative writing? Absolutely. Yeah. Um, so I think, when I think about stories I read and stories I write, Catherine, I'm thinking about what is it about? What else is it about? And what is it really about? And if you can ask yourself that question in your own writing, or in the things you're reading that light your fire, I think it'll help guide you, right? There's there's the top layer and then there's what's underneath. And if you feel lost in your writing, that might help. I hope that answers it. And thank you everybody for spending time with me today. There are other things you could have been doing. I really appreciate it. And it's great to see some of you here. And I hope I run into you out there on Medium. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Danielle. Hope to see some of you out there. Bye. Awesome. Thanks, Karen. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Bye.